Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, Project Manager at the European Neighbourhood Council and the host of the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today's discussion is part of a series of podcasts dedicated to a 4-year-long EU-funded project titled MEDIATIZED EU, with the aim to shed light and communicate the findings and recommendations to a broader audience. Today's recording will help our audience, policymakers, experts, journalists, and ordinary people to understand the project's rationale, objectives, and especially to share initial findings from the recently drafted Polyscoping Report. If you are interested in finding out more about the project and the people behind it, all you have to do is visit our website at www.mediatized.eu, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on Twitter at mediatized_EU. But allow me to introduce my companion in today's interview, Dr. Sonia Boulos, who is a professor of law and international relations at the University of Antonio de Nebrija. So, Sonia, good morning and welcome to the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series.
Good morning.
Sonia, it has been 18 months since the MEDIATIZED EU project officially started. So I would like to start by asking you to briefly tell us, how did we get here? The Polyscoping Report is based on what? How did it came to be?
Okay, I just want to clarify that this is an initial report. So we're going to consolidate our recommendation based on the outcomes that we will receive after, completing our research plan. But basically, this report is based on a desk research that we conducted in all 7 target countries. It surveys the media discourses on the EU and the European integration project starting 2000 till today, focusing on 4 key events: the Eastern enlargement, the economic crisis, the migration crisis, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. It also addresses the question of disinformation and how it is dealt with at the national level. One important point to emphasize also that we conducted this research before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So you have to take into consideration that some things have changed since then.
You mentioned the 4 key areas in which the report focuses on, and I wanted to ask you to guide us through the main key findings in short.
So basically, based on what we surveyed in relation to these 4 key events, we decided in the scoping report, which is oriented towards, policy making, to focus, I would say, on certain issues. And those issues, issues that can impact the way discourses and narratives are constructed in relation to the EU. This includes, for example, media pluralism, lack of sufficient guarantees of the freedom of the media, control of the media, political polarization, or external influence on the media, and the conceptualization of disinformation as a threat. So these kinds of issues, we believe, have a very, could have strong impact on the way discourses are constructed in relation to the EU, and that's why we focused on them.
Now, since we are already, as I said, 1.5 years that we are working on this research project, what do we know now about public opinion in relation to the EU?
Well, basically, pretty much pro-European. In all the target countries, it is evident that the population is basically pro-European. There are fluctuations, but even then, you can see that the public opinion is basically pro-European in all target countries.
Now, with regards to the level of freedom of press or political control of the press, how this can have an impact on perceptions of the EU in the target countries?
This is a really good question. For example, just to give you a concrete example, in many our research suggests that in context where political polarization is very present in the country, the likelihood of media polarization in relation to the EU is much higher. However, we discovered that when political polarization in a specific country does not include the EU, for example, Spain is a very highly polarized country. However, everyone, all the political parties are pro-European. So this political polarization does not affect media polarization in relation to the EU, in the sense that the polarization of the media mirrors the political polarization in which the EU is not a contentious issue. So in other contexts where the political polarization is also on the EU itself, here freedom of the media becomes a key issue. Just to give you an example, if we take countries like Estonia and the Hungarian context, in both countries, there is polarization, political polarization on the EU, which is mirrored to some extent in the media polarization on the EU, but to very different degrees. And when you ask yourself why, the answer is very simple. In the Hungarian context, the state attempts to control the media, not only the state media, but also private media, through regulations and establishing new regulation rules that would enable the state to control even the private media. So this has very negative impact on the ability to introduce discourses that are pro-European, in comparison to a country like Estonia, where the freedom of the press ranks very high, which means that you can see different kinds of arguments and narratives in the relation to the EU. So this is one point in which you see why it is important to guarantee the freedom of the media, to make sure that the public discourses and media discourses on the EU, are relevant and free.
Thanks a lot, Sonia. Now, moving into disinformation. Disinformation has been, is actually one of the four key areas of this report. Disinformation campaigns in European states have mainly targeted the EU and its policies, exploiting issues such as the economic and migratory crisis, the rise of populism, and Brexit. My question is, what is the level of concern among European citizens regarding the spread of disinformation?
Well, European citizens tend to be very worried about disinformation, that in many contexts, European citizens are aware of the threat of disinformation. They are worried about it. And also, we can see that in all target countries, some measures were adopted to fight disinformation. However, we can see differences between countries in terms of even on the conceptual level. How do you understand disinformation? To what extent you understand it as a threat, security threat, and a threat to democratic processes in the countries, and a threat also to the EU integration project. Although there are measures almost in all countries that we surveyed, one of the things that we found that in countries where the government itself is responsible for disseminating disinformation on the EU, or facilitates that disinformation targeting the EU, such as the case of Hungary, the mechanisms or the plans, national plans to fight disinformation seem to be very weak or inefficient in those contexts where you can see that the government itself is responsible to some extent to the circulation of disinformation narratives on the EU.
What is the level of trust with regards to media, whether it is traditional media or online media?
Well, unfortunately, there has been some, let's say, European constituency is more suspicious of the traditional media, shows less trust. But in some contexts, this have changed after the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly, the COVID-19 pandemic, people started watching, the news or going back to traditional media for information. But still, we have to be very careful about this. We have to be very careful about this because today it is evident that in most countries in our project, the source for disinformation narratives and conspiracy theories is social media. So if the trust in the traditional media drops, people are going to look for other sources for information. So they're going to turn to social media, where the risks of being exposed to disinformation is higher. So that's something that we should be careful about. Let's be hopeful that this tendency of gaining trust now in the traditional media continues.
Now, have you spotted any significant differences among the 7 target countries in this from this preliminary phase of the project?
Yes, I will start with the similarities, actually, which is an important point to start with the things that are common. Then I will tell you a little bit more about the differences. One very noticeable similarity is that in all 7 countries, the media talks about the same things when it talks about the EU. And another thing that was evident, that the same events that are debated in the 7 countries could have different significance for each country, meaning that the media could be discussing a topic, even though this topic has less implications for the national arena. An example is the immigration crisis. You can see debates over that even in countries that didn't suffer from any kind of consequences as a result of this crisis. For example, Estonia, which shows us that political elites and media elites can draw political capital from controversial issues, even when those issues do not affect their own country. So more or less, we talk about the same things in all 7 countries. However, and one more thing that I would like to mention in this context, which is a bit problematic. When the media debates EU issues, it always presents them from a domestic perspective. So when the Belgian media or the Spanish media or the Estonian media talk about something that is related to the EU, they always highlight, emphasize, or speak about the national aspect. What do we gain? Is it good for us, bad for us? But there's no European perspective on things. And this could have negative implications for the future of the European integration project, in the sense that these issues should be discussed from a European perspective, not only national perspective. Now, moving to the differences, one of the key differences that we noticed is what kind of arguments are used to talk about the EU. In the eastern part of Europe, identity-based arguments are more dominant. They're not exclusive, they're more dominant. You see more identity-based arguments. What do I mean by identity-based? It's like arguments that, joining the EU, for example, could pose a threat to our national identity, to our national and religious values, or could strengthen, democratic values in our societies. So these kinds of arguments, we could call them identity-based arguments. In the Western part, we see more pragmatic arguments in terms of, what are we going to gain? What are we going to lose? But also, it's important to emphasize that everywhere you can find, also pragmatic and also, identity-based arguments, even if they're not the dominant ones. For example, in relation to the immigration crisis, even in the Western part, some of the arguments that were raised are basically identity-based arguments, that some immigrants pose a threat to our culture, values, etc. So this is one of the main differences that we noted. Another thing that also we noted, that in some parts of Europe, joining the EU is seen as an alternative to something, and this something is the Russian influence, meaning the way the issue is discussed is like EU is an alternative to escaping the Russian influence. This is very much what happens in certain parts in the eastern parts of Europe, whereas in other parts of Europe the EU is not an alternative to something. Another thing that is also, which is related to this point, is like in some contexts, the foreign influence, basically Russia, is overt and very noticeable in some contexts, whereas in other contexts is not as much noticeable. That doesn't say that there's no attempt on the part of foreign states to impact domestic discourses on the EU, but it is more covert, not as the case of some countries where you can see it clearly.
Honestly, I'm quite excited to learn more about the report and also what's next in this research project. At this point, our discussion has come to an end. This podcast was an opportunity, actually, as a teaser of what's going to be presented in September, towards the end of September. For our audience, I would like to let you know that there will be an event that will take place in Brussels dedicated to the Polyscoping Report. At this point, I would like to thank you, Sonia, for taking the time to join us today virtually and for sharing your thoughts and information regarding the Polyscoping Report of the MEDIATIZED EU project. It was a pleasure to have you virtually with me today.
Thank you, Andreas.
I'm Andreas Marazis, and that was the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series.